The morning arrived quietly, the way mornings often do before something important happens. A pale golden light crept across the stone walls of the palace, touching the tall windows and the polished marble floors inside. Birds sang in the garden beyond the iron gates, and somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimed 7 times. The world outside was waking up slowly, as it always did, with no particular awareness of what the day would bring. Inside the palace, however, no one was calm. Servants moved quickly through the long corridors, carrying pressed uniforms, silver trays of tea, and thick stacks of papers. Officials spoke to each other in low, careful voices that were meant to seem casual but were not. The head of palace communications, a small and sharp woman named Mrs. Harlow, stood near the main entrance hall with a notepad in her hand and a look on her face that communicated, without a single word, that today was not going to be a simple day. The reason for this anxiety was easy enough to state, but far less easy to manage. Prince Edmund was going outside. He was 23 years old, the youngest member of the royal family, and in recent months he had become the subject of a great deal of public conversation. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because of a scandal or a mistake. Simply because people were beginning to ask questions that had not often been asked before, questions about the royal family's place in a modern world, about what they actually contributed, about whether the ceremonies and the traditions and the grand old buildings still meant what they once had. These were honest questions, many people said. Others called them disrespectful. Either way, they were being asked every day, on every television channel and in every newspaper, and Edmund's face had somehow ended up at the center of the conversation. He had not chosen this. He had simply been born into it, the way people are born into all the most important facts of their lives. Edmund was not the sort of young man who sought attention or thrived under public scrutiny. He was thoughtful and quiet by nature, the kind of person who preferred a long book and a cup of tea to a formal reception. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed small things, the way light changed in a room, the difference in a person's voice when they were saying something true versus something polite. He had kind eyes and a habit of apologizing when he walked into furniture, which happened more often than one might expect from a prince who had grown up in these very rooms. He was not cold or remote. He was, in truth, somewhat ordinary, and depending on who was looking, that ordinariness was either his greatest strength or the most troubling thing about him. Today, he was scheduled to attend the official opening of a new community garden in the eastern part of the city, a project that the royal family had helped fund over the past 2 years. It was intended to be a warm and uncomplicated occasion. Flowers, children, a few brief words of thanks, some photographs. The sort of event that went smoothly and was forgotten pleasantly by the following morning. But 3 days before the scheduled appearance, a group of citizens had announced publicly that they planned to gather near the garden to express their views. They were not planning anything disruptive or dangerous. They simply wished to be seen, to hold their signs in a public place and say, through their presence alone, that they had opinions about the institution that Edmund represented. In a city that valued the freedom of expression, they had every right to do this. And so the palace had been preparing, with growing nervousness, ever since. Edmund was told about this at breakfast, over eggs and toast and a pot of strong tea. He set his cup down and looked at Mrs. Harlow for a quiet moment. "Will they be nearby?" he asked. "They will be visible," she said, choosing the word carefully. He considered this, then nodded and picked up his toast. "Then we go," he said simply. This was not the response Mrs. Harlow had been hoping for. She had prepared 3 separate plans for cancellation, each built around a different plausible excuse: a scheduling conflict, a minor health concern, an urgent internal matter requiring his presence at the palace. Edmund turned all 3 down before she could finish presenting them. He said it would not be right to cancel. The garden had been built for the people of that community, and those people deserved to see it opened properly. He said this without drama, without any particular emphasis, the way people state things that seem obvious to them. Mrs. Harlow wrote something on her notepad with rather more force than was strictly necessary. The convoy left the palace just before 10 o'clock. 2 dark cars, 3 motorcycles leading the way, and a third vehicle carrying members of the royal guard. The streets were already lined when they arrived, some people waving, some just watching with quiet curiosity, and some, near the far end of the street behind iron barriers, holding signs with words written in large, unmistakable letters. Edmund saw the signs through the car window. He read them without changing his expression. Then the car came to a stop, the door was opened from outside, and he stepped out onto the pavement and into the morning light. The sound that met him was layered and complex. There was genuine, warm applause from the crowd gathered near the garden entrance, the kind of applause that means people are actually pleased to see someone. There were cheers from a group of schoolchildren who had been brought for the occasion, all of them wearing matching yellow scarves and clutching handmade cards they had clearly worked hard on. And from further down the street, steady and rhythmic and impossible to ignore, there was the sound of chanting. Edmund stood on the pavement and took a slow breath. 2 steps behind him and slightly to his left stood the senior member of his Royal Guard for the day. His name was Sergeant William Okafor, and he had served in the Royal Guard for 19 years. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, with a calm, focused face that had learned, over nearly 2 decades of service, to reveal very little of what was happening behind it. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was the kind that does not require effort anymore. His eyes moved constantly across the crowd, not nervously, but with the steady, professional attention of someone whose job is to notice what other people miss. Okafor had stood guard in far more complicated situations than this one. He had been present at high-stakes international events, at public ceremonies where the atmosphere had been genuinely tense, at moments that required every person in his position to be completely focused and completely still. He was experienced and unshakable, and he was, on this particular morning, watching Prince Edmund very carefully. Edmund had begun moving along the path toward the garden entrance, stopping to greet volunteers and accept the children's handmade cards. He was doing well. His smile was genuine rather than performed. He crouched to ask a small girl in a yellow scarf what her favorite flower was, and she told him very seriously that it was the sunflower, because it always turned to face the light. He said that was an excellent reason to love something, and he meant it. But the chanting was becoming louder as the group near the barriers grew more confident. The palace officials walking behind Edmund began to exchange glances. One of them leaned close to Mrs. Harlow and spoke quietly into her ear. She shook her head. He spoke again. She shook her head a second time, more firmly. Edmund kept moving, accepting another card from a boy who had drawn the garden with an enormous sun taking up nearly half the paper and small, cheerful stick figures below it. That sun is quite large, Edmund observed. I like it big, the boy told him seriously. I think that's exactly right, said Edmund. He moved on. He accepted 2 more cards. He shook 3 more hands. He looked at a display board showing the garden's planting plan and asked a volunteer a genuine question about which plants had been chosen for the shadier corners. The volunteer, who had clearly not expected a real question, looked momentarily startled and then very pleased to answer. And then Edmund stopped walking. Not because someone asked him to. Not because he had reached the next planned stop. He simply stopped, in the middle of the path, and turned. Not toward the garden entrance. Toward the far end of the street, where the group stood behind the barriers with their signs and their steady chanting voices. He looked at them, not with irritation or dismissal, not with the politely blank expression that public figures often wear when they wish to acknowledge something without engaging with it, but with real, direct attention. The kind of attention that costs something. The officials behind him stopped moving. Mrs. Harlow looked up from her notepad. Several photographers raised their cameras at precisely the same moment. Sergeant Okafor took one quiet step forward. What he did next was not in any manual. It was not part of any briefing. It was not consistent with any version of protocol that anyone in the Royal Guard had ever been formally taught. It was, by every official standard, completely outside the boundaries of his role. He did not step in front of Edmund to redirect him. He did not signal to the other guards. He did not take Edmund's arm or speak loudly enough for the surrounding officials to hear. He simply moved close to Edmund and spoke to him, quietly and directly, as one person speaks to another when they want to say something true. Later, a lip reader who worked for one of the major newspapers studied the footage from the cameras that had been closest to the moment, and pieced together what was said. You don't have to go over there, Okafor told him. But if you want to, I'll walk with you. The officials went very still. Mrs. Harlow's pen stopped moving entirely. Several people held their breath without quite meaning to. Edmund looked at the sergeant. Something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked, to the people who later studied the photographs from that moment, like being recognized. Like someone had just said the thing that needed to be said and had said it simply. He looked back toward the group at the far end of the street. Then back at Okafor. "Let's walk," Edmund said. They walked together. They did not cross the barriers, that was neither possible nor the point. But they walked close enough that the people holding signs could see Edmund's face, could see that he was looking at them and not looking away. He stopped a short distance from the nearest barrier and stood there, quietly, for a moment that felt longer than it was. One of the people in the group, a woman in her 40s, wearing a blue coat, who had been chanting with the others, stopped chanting. She looked at Edmund. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that was very simple and very hard to define. She said, in a voice clear enough to carry over the noise around her, "We just want things to be fair." Edmund nodded once. "I know," he said. "I hear you." He did not make grand promises. He did not try to resolve, in those few seconds, the complex and genuine disagreements that had brought that group to the street. He did not pretend that 3 words were the same as an answer. He simply said them, "I hear you," and stood there a moment longer, and then turned and walked back. The chanting continued. But it softened, briefly, as he walked away. Behind him, the officials were not moving. They were looking at Okafor with expressions that ranged from confusion to something that more closely resembled quiet distress. A member of the royal guard had spoken directly to a member of the royal family, in public, without being asked, in a way that had clearly shaped what the royal family member then chose to do. This was not how things were done. This was not, in any reading of any regulation, what a royal guard's role looked like. One senior official approached Okafor the moment Edmund had moved on toward the garden entrance. "That was not your place," the official said, keeping his voice very controlled. Okafor looked at him steadily and without defensiveness. "No, sir," he said. "It wasn't." He did not apologize. He did not explain. He offered no further comment, and when the official appeared to be waiting for one, Okafor simply returned his gaze to the crowd. The garden opening continued. Edmund planted a small apple tree in the center of the main bed, pressing the dark soil carefully around its roots. A photographer nearby captured the moment, the prince's hands in the earth, his jacket slightly dusty at the knees from where he had crouched down to reach the roots properly. Someone offered him a cloth to clean his hands. He thanked them and set it aside. He spoke briefly to the crowd before leaving. He thanked the volunteers by name, he had clearly read the program and remembered them. He said that spaces like this one mattered not because of who planted them or who opened them, but because they belonged, genuinely and completely, to the people who would use them every day. His voice was steady. He did not look like a man who had been through a difficult morning. He looked, if anything, like someone who had set something down that he had been carrying for a while. The matter of Sergeant Okafor was raised that same evening in a meeting at the palace. It was raised again the following morning in a different meeting with different people. An internal inquiry was opened, as regulations required. Okafor attended it without a lawyer, answered every question directly, and did not attempt to argue that what he had done fell within his official role, because it clearly had not. He said only that he had watched Edmund walking toward something difficult, and had not wanted him to do it alone. He said that keeping someone safe is not only about standing between them and harm. The inquiry took 3 weeks. Its conclusion was carefully worded. It noted that Sergeant Okafor had operated outside the defined parameters of his role. It also noted that no harm had occurred, and that a number of witnesses had suggested that the outcome of the day had been, on balance, positive. It recommended no formal penalty. Okafor returned to his duties the following Monday and said nothing to the press. In the weeks that followed, those who worked closely with Edmund began to notice changes. Small ones, at first. He began requesting visits to events that had not been planned for him. He asked to meet with community groups he had no prior connection to. He asked Mrs. Harlow, on 2 separate occasions, whether there were people who had written to the palace and had not yet received a response. She pulled out a list. It was much longer than he had expected. He sat down with it and began reading from the top. The apple tree he had planted grew through the following months with the uncomplicated determination of young things that have been given good soil. By the following spring, it had produced its first small blossoms, white and delicate and quietly certain of themselves. Volunteers photographed it and shared the pictures with the community. School groups came to visit and learned its name and the story of the day it was planted, at least the version of the story that fit neatly into a 10-minute lesson. The fuller version was harder to explain, and perhaps not necessary to explain. Some things are better understood by being witnessed than by being described. The woman in the blue coat still passed the garden sometimes on her way to work. She would slow down when she did, and look at the tree for a moment, and occasionally at the small plaque beside it. Then she would continue on her way, carrying with her, along with everything else she carried, the memory of a young man who had stopped and turned and looked at her, and 3 plain words that had not solved anything and had somehow, in their smallness and their honesty, mattered anyway. She had not expected to be heard that day. Most people in her position did not expect it. That, perhaps, was why it stayed with her.